Morning, Len.
Good morning, Jodi.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. We've got lots of participants coming in. So first of all, welcome to Newhouse this morning. Glad you were able to join us. With me today is Len Downie Jr., the legendary editor of the Washington Post, whose career spanned 1964 to 2008, and you're now at Arizona State teaching, right?
Right, from Washington, D.C.
Okay. You started as a reporter, but in that tenure, you worked on the impeachment or near impeachment of two presidents, 9/11, the Unabomber manifesto, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You covered some of the great stories in the last couple of decades. I didn't actually seek out people to talk to before as prep for this interview. But a number of people I mentioned that I was going to be talking to all said, "Oh, say hello for me," which I think in a newsroom of at one point 900 people says a lot about an editor that also nurtures careers. So I think both of those things are going to be important to talk about today. But first, I have a question about your process. We're going to talk a little bit about your book, All About the Story. And I was surprised in reading some of it, the level of detail that you were able to include, including details about a story 30 years ago that was never published. The name of the photographer who called in on 9/11 and said, "You should change the camera on the top of the Post to look at the Pentagon because it's burning." Do you keep a personal diary? Do you have a great memory, or were some of these details actually published somewhere?
Right. Neither one of the first two. I wish I'd kept a diary, but I didn't. It really was I really wish I had. And my memory's okay, but not great. Now, instead, I keep files. And I had voluminous files at the Washington Post from all of my work, some files at home. And after I retired in 2008, they gave me an office upstairs for a while as the vice president of the company. I maintained my files up there with my longtime assistant, Pat O'Shea. And then when they moved to their current building, there was no more room for me because they had all this fancy digital stuff going on there. So we had to pack up my files so that we had to sort through them. And it was while doing that I realized I really should write a memoir, probably. And I asked around about that to see if people thought that my story would be worth reading. And Bob Woodward, of all people, who writes all these books, ordered me to write a memoir. And since I've been giving him orders for several decades, it was fine to hear an order from him. And I decided to go ahead and do this. So I went through all my files, and then there are other files. Ben Bradley and Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein all have files at the Ransom Center where's the Ransom Center? In Texas, the University of Texas. And there are other places to do various kinds of research. I read a lot of books, over the years. Various Washington Post people and others had interviewed me for books about things that we did over the years, like the Clintons and other things. And I forgot, what I said in those interviews, and so there they were in the books. So just a lot of research, and I did all my own research. Not hire a researcher.
That's great. So let's start at the beginning. As I said, you joined the paper in 1964, sort of, as you call it, an accidental intern.
Mm-hmm.
There was some confusion, but you were able to talk your way into getting the internship and ultimately the job. And by the time Watergate hit a few years later, you were doing a lot of editing at that point. And one of the things that strikes me when I read stories about Watergate is how young everybody was. Woodward and Bernstein were, 24, 25?
Little
You could
over
have been more than 30, maybe?
I was 30 during the break-in. I was 30. By the time Nixon resigned, I was 32.
So, I mean, this is a lot of, they were able to keep the story because obviously it started as a weekend crime story about a break-in and became something much, much bigger. But you also write in the book that there was really only one mistake that the Washington Post made in that 2-year period, 2+ year period, where and I think it was a grand jury testimony that the information was right, but it hadn't actually been delivered to the grand jury.
Correct.
When you look back on that, are you surprised at how accurate everything that was being done actually turned out to be, especially since they were doing some of their interviews in code, they were meeting in garages.
Right.
It was very much tiny pieces together.
I wasn't surprised that we were as accurate as we were. First of all, we required that Carl and Bob record all their interviews, write memos, including all of the information from all their interviews. And at the top of each of the pages of those, they had to put the name of the source. These are mostly confidential sources. They had promised to keep them confidential for as long as the sources lived, or until the source released them from the confidentiality promise, which was a very important part of Watergate. We also insisted that all the information that we published come from at least two different sources with separate knowledge of what it was they were talking about, not that they had told each other. And they were able to find, in some cases, records and other things. And then the stories were put through many different editors to make sure that it was going to be accurate before it was published. Often the stories were held until more information was gotten. There's a famous scene in the movie All the President's Men about that, where Ben Bradley allowed the story to go forward, but cut out a lot of the stuff that was not yet proven. So it just went through a lot of scrutiny before we published each story.
I also, as part of this interview, I went back and looked at your book from 50 years ago or so, The New Muckrakers,
Yeah.
which was sort of a summary of some names we're still familiar with today: Woodward Bernstein, Cy Hirsch, Bartlett and Steele, and others. And while I will say that in your new book, you're more generous, there are some descriptions of some of those folks that are not particularly likable people. You know, Bernstein in particular was sort of a womanizer. He was a partier. He was a little bit predatory on other people's stories. He would sneak in edits after the edit process had already taken place. I think Woodward you're a little more generous with, but he was a little bit secretive at times. How does that sort of play into what they were able to do, that they weren't necessarily always likable and could be difficult to manage?
With the exception of yourself, Jodi, most investigative reporters are not normal people. It's what makes us good investigative reporters. We're all abnormal in different ways. In my case, I'm antisocial. I like spending a lot of time in records before it became too complicated in the digital age for me to do that, and various other aspects. But in the case of, Carl's gregariousness was a big asset as an investigative reporter. You could not hang up the phone on Carl. I would listen in sometimes to some of his phone conversations because I wanted to hear what was happening, and just couldn't hang up on him. And in Bob's case, Bob is he's very meticulous. He's meticulous about his life. He kept a toothbrush in his desk drawer, brushed his teeth after lunch every day in the newsroom, after dinner if he was there that late. Very careful about every aspect of his life. Whereas Carl literally kept new shirts in their original bags underneath piles of paper on his desk in case he wasn't going to make it home at night and had to change in the office. So there's just there are a lot of quirks about investigative reporters. Cy Hirsch was in that book, a chapter in that book, is a bully. He knows that I think that. In fact, I think he knows he knows that he is, and that's how he pushes people in his interviews. Whereas Woodward is almost obsequious, is a word I would use sometimes. When he would come into my office to see me over the years when he was working on books, and also doing work for the Post, he would always come in. He would come in and he would say, "Len, you're really the greatest editor I think in history." And I would say, "Bob, what do you want from me that you don't think you can get from me?" That's the way he handled his interviews. He began every interview. This is very good for your students. He began every interview by asking, "I need your help. How can you? I need your help. Please help me." And he would end in every interview by saying, "Who else can help me out on this?" And that was always very important in his modus operandi.
That's interesting. You also point out in the book that not just Woodward and Bernstein, but other reporters as well, the importance of developing sources over time and the importance of uh, not just calling, but physically being in the same room with somebody that you're trying to get to talk to you. You've talked about, your career obviously at the Washington Post is exceptional. How do you build that kind of rapport? And part of the reason that source development was so important is in so many stories you cover, that source became important 20 years later because their careers advanced as well. How do you manage that? How do you get to that?
Well, you should, young reporters should regard everybody that they have to interview ever for a story as a potential long-term source. So you want to establish, you don't do favors, you don't make friends, but you do want to establish a certain empathy, a certain kind of relationship where it's you make clear to them that they are important to your understanding of what it is you want to report on, that they're helping you perform a public service, and you stay in touch with them. You just call them up periodically, ask them how they're doing. Another thing that Woodward would often do at the beginning of meeting somebody was, how do you do your work? What is it like being a general of the Army? What is it like being a junior person in the Nixon campaign? What is it like being literally when he started out at the Post, being somebody who inspects restaurants? And that engages the person in a way. And so you stay in touch with them. As I say, you never do them favors, and you never let them do you favors, but you just stay in touch with them as human beings over the years. And gradually they will, in many cases, they'll get increasingly important jobs and be increasingly important sources to you over time.
That sort of boundless curiosity, I also think, is a very important hallmark of a good reporter. Do you think that has changed at all over time? And one of the reasons I'm asking this, that kind of curiosity combined with a certain amount of assertiveness or even aggression. I'm thinking about a student who did a review. She was a grad student that we had a survey last year, and the professor had said repeatedly, you need to get in there, you need to make calls, you need to go after people, if you're there when the ambulance is there, jump in. And she said, I'm a young woman of color. If I jump into an ambulance, that's going to cause a problem.
Right.
So has the world changed in that way, or do reporters still need to be just as aggressive as they always were?
Reporters need to be aggressive appropriately. You need to judge your circumstances. Bob Woodward would never jump in the ambulance, but he would be there at the hospital when the ambulance arrived. He would have already talked to any doctors or admissions people he could talk to, so they had the place wired by the time that the source arrived at the hospital, as opposed to jumping. So it needs to be appropriate to your circumstances. Whether male, female makes a difference. Obviously, race can make a difference. It's one of the reasons why you need to always need to look appropriate in a way that will not scare people off in terms of your dress and your demeanor.
So brush your teeth and change your shirt.
Brush your teeth and change your shirt. So it's a matter of figuring out the best way in which to gain that access.
I'm going to go to one of the questions that we've got from students, and some of these we'll get to later. But Anthony asks, what the specific qualities that set a great investigative reporter apart from a good investigative reporter?
Curiosity, determination, what I call mission. And when I teach investigative reporting and I teach those reporters, this is a mission. It's not a normal life. You're going to be working long hours. You're going to be spending inordinate times on the computer, or back in my time before digital, in records offices for hours on end, doing things that are not normal for normal people. And obviously being able to engage people and to be able to get information out of people. But also nowadays, obviously, to handle records and the data journalism that you teach is a terrific advantage for investigative reporters that didn't exist before the computer age. and being able to write. This is interesting because when I was a young investigative reporter, I was a terrible writer. Many of us who were investigative reporters were terrible writers. I became a better editor than a writer for reasons that aren't quite clear to me. And so I was able to discover that, Bob Woodward, for instance, needed a lot of help with his writing. But Carl Bernstein was a good writer, and that was an advantage for him. So all of those things are necessary. But tireless devotion to your mission is essential to investigative reporting.
Well, let's talk about mission for a second. One of the questions I get from a lot of students who are embarking on investigative reporting, they ask the question, well, how do you know when you're done? How do you respond to that?
Well, sometimes you're never done. Watergate went on for 2 years, and even after Nixon had resigned, there were still things to find out, which then Bob and Carl put into books. But you know you're done when your editor or your producer says, okay, this particular story is ready to go, or this particular series is ready to go, a series of articles or series of reports on television. But then don't stop. If you've done your work well and you've got a really good subject, you'll find that you're giving more tips. There's more follow-up to do. One of the disadvantages of investigative reporting in the past that I recall was this idea that you write this big series of 7 articles and they're published, Sunday through Saturday, and then you want to move on to the next subject. You're tired with it. But if you're patient, you'll be getting tips from people as a result of what you've written, and there'll be follow-ups, and sometimes the story will get bigger. A good example is the Walter Reed Hospital stories that Dana Priest and another reporter did at the Washington Post. The first articles were about the fact that the living conditions and all the conditions at Walter Reed for the veterans who were being operated on there were terrible. And as a result of the series, immediately changes were made. The Secretary of the Army was fired. The people were sent into the hospital immediately to begin doing work on the buildings and so on. But they didn't stop there, because they began getting tips saying, wait a minute, there's something else going on. There's this thing called PTSD that you may not have heard about. And right now, the Veterans Administration and the military doesn't know how to handle it. And it's a big problem. And that led to a whole other series of stories that they would not have done if they weren't paying attention. They decided they weren't finished with the original stories, despite the fact that it led to media changes and led to a Pulitzer Prize that kept going when they got more information.
Yeah, and that story became really important in the early years of the war, and how soldiers who were coming back were actually being treated.
Ann Hall was the name of the other reporter with Dana Priest. I don't want to leave her name out.
Thank you. Speaking of the mission too, I was also sort of struck that a number of the journalists you describe in both books, actually, they are what I would consider now very activist. They had a point of view. They were sure something was going on. They went out to find the evidence in the interview that supported it. In some ways you describe Bernstein as almost a crusader. How does that fit for a modern journalist, and whether or not they can be activists, and how can they be activists?
I would disagree with the term activist and the term point of view. I guess I don't know how you define activist. I would define activist as somebody who's seeking a certain outcome. And for instance, all during Watergate, we were not seeking the outcome of the resignation of the President of the United States or even his impeachment. Instead, we were trying to find out what's gone wrong here. Something's wrong, and that's what ought to be the motivation for an investigative reporter. Is not the outcome is for somebody. The impact is for somebody else to decide on what the impact should be. The investigative reporter is pursuing what's wrong, and also if there are in the reporting suggestions from people about things that are going right that might correct something, that's part of the reporting as well. But you should not be seeking a particular outcome yourself. That's for the editorial writers, for the columnists, and for your readers.
So again, back to that mission, you said that as the managing editor and as executive editor at the Washington Post, you chose not to vote because you wanted to make sure that you always had an open mind about anything you might have to make a decision about. The policy, I think it's still in effect at the Washington Post, is also that journalists cannot engage in any demonstrations. They can't get in any marches. Is that sort of the bright line that you think is still in place for journalists?
Yes, if I were still running a news organization, I would insist on that. And it is still the policy at the Washington Post. You can vote, even though I didn't. Everybody else can vote, but you cannot engage in any other political activity. You can't work for candidates. You cannot contribute to candidates or political parties. You cannot contribute to causes that come before Congress. So, for instance, you would not be able to contribute to Planned Parenthood, for example, on one side, or anti-abortion on the other side. And you cannot sign petitions or march in demonstrations, as you said. Voting is the only political activity you can engage in, because I want people to not be partisan and biased in their reporting, especially when the reporting is going to create a lot of controversy. And when you're going to have people like the current president of the United States accusing you of fake news and bias, I want you to be able to show that you do not have a bias. I know that for younger journalists nowadays, for the younger generation, this is difficult, and in many cases is being rejected because they think they should be seeking certain outcomes, that is part of their work. But I don't agree with that.
How do you tell your students how to manage some of the vitriol that they run into when they're doing reporting?
Well,
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, to try to ignore it, obviously, to seek counsel with your teachers, with your editors, with your producers, but not to react to it, and particularly not to react to it online. The other thing I say to my students all the time, and say to your students now, is to remind you that everything that you do on social media, everything that you do digitally, is now part of your permanent record and will be for the rest of your life. So if you have, and that includes even what you're telling your friends, and not necessarily what you're putting out on some social media website. 20 years from now, you'll be covering something really controversial, and you're doing very important reporting, and people who are opposed to hearing that and are opposed to having you report that will go back to 20 years earlier to something you said on social media in college, and say, look, see, you're biased. We shouldn't believe anything you have to say. That's fake news.
Just as if you're running for political office, you should probably be prepared for that opposition research.
Yes.
So in terms of the mission, I mean, where you're describing a very important job, a very difficult job, and it's cost you personally. You say in the book too that 2 marriages failed, probably for one reason or another, because of the amount of time that you spent being a reporter and editor. How should journalists be prepared for that kind of a life?
Right. This is one reason why a lot of journalists marry other journalists, because they can understand the life. You have to be prepared for this being a potentially antisocial mission that you're going on. I always use that word because the hours will be long if you're doing your job well. Often there'll be tensions of the kind that you were talking about earlier, of people attacking you for what you're doing. The tensions of having the difficulties in getting the reporting done, of trying to prove what it is you think that can be proven, for example. And all of this is not good for a social life or even potentially for family life, which means that you need to figure out how to manage a social life and a family life that can be that could be congruent to your work.
Let's talk for a few minutes about how things are the same and how they may be different now compared to the decades where you were editor, managing editor, executive editor, or reporter at the Post. During the Watergate era and the late 60s, there were plenty of protests. There were reporters who were arrested. There was a lot of social and cultural unrest. Does it feel familiar now, or does now feel very different from that?
What feels different now is, except for the South during the Civil Rights Movement, covering the Civil Rights Movement could be dangerous. Reporters were in danger doing that. But usually, even during Watergate, when we We made sure the phones at the Post weren't tapped, and we made sure that we were careful about our personal lives because maybe somebody was watching us to try to catch us doing something wrong. Somebody literally tried to sell Carl Bernstein marijuana on a downtown street corner in Washington, that's how ridiculous that was. But the kinds of dangers, the kinds of attacks on the press now are worse than they were back then. Back then we at the Washington Post were being attacked all the time, and that was very scary. We felt we were in this dark tunnel for a long time because we were alone on the story. There was no internet back then. There were no cable television channels. Only the Wall Street Journal was a nationally circulated newspaper. So the reporting we were doing on Watergate for many, many months, we were all alone on because nobody else was picking it up. And because political reporters couldn't believe that these kids on the Metro staff of the Washington Post really were finding something wrong with the Nixon administration. They just couldn't believe that was possible. So that was kind of scary, but there was not the kind of, and Nixon was attacking the press, and his press secretary was attacking not the press, but the Washington Post in particular, but the rest of the press wasn't being affected by that. Nowadays, you've got a number of, you literally have a cable channel, national cable network, and many, many websites and social media sites that are constantly attacking the press and reporters by name. The President of the United States attacks reporters by name, and there are threats may be made to reporters. Crowds are being stirred up to boo and hiss and be angry at reporters in their midst. And in demonstrations, reporters are being beaten by police, being arrested when they're just doing their work, and antagonism from various peoples in crowds. All of this was not the case back in the day during the massive demonstrations to get the Vietnam War in the 1960s. When I was out in the street helping to cover them, the reporters, neither the demonstrators nor the police nor the military ever were hostile to the reporters. Instead, we were treated as important chroniclers of what was going on. And so what's happening to reporters now is both different and, to me, very scary.
And do you think that this is a permanent state, given how polarized we are as a nation? Or do you think some of it will actually change with the new president? Or this is sort of where we are now as journalists?
To some extent, this is where we are now, because no matter who wins the election, there are still lots of people out there who have been attacking fact-finding press and will continue to attack fact-finding press. In fact, if Trump loses, they may become more vitriolic than ever and more angry than ever. And so it's clearly not a passing thing. I would hope that if there is a new president, that the new president could to some extent calm down the country and end some of the divisiveness. But it's not going to happen quickly, that's for sure. And so I can't predict the future.
So let's talk about some of the stories that you have covered and some of the administrations that you have covered. So if I named a president and asked you in one word to tell me what your first response is, sort of a word game, could you do that?
Okay.
Let's start with Nixon.
Corruption.
Okay. You might want to keep that word in your back pocket as well. How about Reagan?
Smooth.
Okay.
Can I add to that answer?
Sure.
Fact checking began with Ronald Reagan. He, in his speeches and in his press conferences, he liked to tell stories, most of which were not true. And so I started a sidebar story to most of those stories that actually said what was not true and what the truth was. And that was the beginning of fact checking, but nobody remembers that, and nobody paid much attention to it at the time because he was so smooth that everybody loved him so much that nobody paid attention to that. In fact, sometimes Democrats would write me letters saying, "Why do you let him get away with that?" And I would say, we put all those stories in the newspaper. Well, they never really noticed them.
How about Bush 2?
George W. Bush?
Yep.
Iraq.
Okay. Bill Clinton.
6.
Obama.
Well, it has to be 2 words, message control.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Clinton and Obama for a second. You have a lot of descriptions about meetings you had with both Bill and Hillary, and that they were both very defensive and very protective. At the same time, you also talk a little bit about Obama and that his administration was somewhat disappointing in terms of transparency. That it wasn't quite the openness that journalists had hoped for. Can you talk a little bit about those two
Yeah,
presidents?
in case of the Clintons, it actually was very different in my encounters with the two of them. And also different from what I was told by our really brilliant White House reporter what was going on inside the White House. I did have a meeting with Hillary Clinton that I detail in the book relatively early on in the administration, where she was very unhappy with our coverage of the Whitewater situation in Arkansas, the savings and loan that went bankrupt and cost taxpayers a lot of money and involved fraud. And she was the lawyer for the savings and loan at the time, and he was the governor of Arkansas at the time. Raised real questions about conflict of interest, and she was unhappy with our coverage of that. And that was the beginning of the meeting, and then went on to her. Volunteering, because I didn't bring it up first, volunteering that she was also very unhappy with things that had been reported about Bill Clinton and the state troopers who accused him of having sexual liaisons with their assistants, and so it was I thought it was a proper meeting in which she stated all of her concerns about our coverage, and I tried to explain that this was not we had to hold all administrations accountable for their actions, all presidents and accountable for their actions, and this was no different. And I also said that I was always available for any particular concerns they had, any particular complaints they had. I wanted to hear them. I wanted our coverage to be accurate and to not be antagonistic by any means. And I then heard later from our White House reporter that when she got back to the White House, she thought she thought that I thought I was lying all the time, and that I really didn't like the Clintons. And then later on during the administration, I heard that she would tell people in the White House that I was jealous of Ben Bradley, my predecessor, because he had forced the resignation of Richard Nixon, and I wanted to force the resignation of Bill Clinton in order to equal Ben, which was not true at all. On the other hand, and I heard many other times about how unhappy she was about our coverage. On the other hand, Bill Clinton, I had several encounters with, one on the telephone and in person that I talk about in the book. He always avoided any criticism of our coverage, and in fact told me we're doing just fine, even though I knew again from our White House reporters that, in fact, from his press secretary, who told me at one point, whenever Bill Clinton is using your name, he's screaming at me. And I said, well, he can scream at me. Margaret Thatcher was, when I was in Britain as a London correspondent, she certainly was forthright about her concerns about coverage. He could too, but he just didn't want to confront it, despite the fact he was apparently unhappy about it.
And how was the Obama administration disappointing in transparency?
Well, the president promised on his very first day would be the most transparent administration in history, and it definitely was not. They were very sophisticated in their message control. They used the internet in very sophisticated ways to get their messages across. They literally would sometimes keep television networks from covering some White House events, and instead would cover them themselves on a digital website that they had, a White House news website that they had, among other things. And they would argue with reporters about the premises of stories that reporters are asking about. They would often require that there be monitors on interviews, which I think has continued in this administration.
Basically a minder, you mean, with the reporter?
A reminder, yes. And so very controlling of their message. But never publicly castigating the press the way this administration does.
You've been involved in some of the most difficult decisions that an editor would have to make, from Watergate to the Pentagon Papers, when the Unabomber delivered a manifesto and said, you have to publish this or people will die. You sent reporters to Iraq and Afghanistan. What do you think is one of the most difficult decisions you've ever had to make as an editor?
Well, there were a couple of them. The first one you already mentioned, which was the Unabomber, and that was the only decision that I never made, that I did not make by myself. The publisher, Don Graham, had a good relationship, very good relationship with me. He would often give me advice, make suggestions, but he always left the news decisions to myself, and everything, all decisions about the newsroom to me. Personnel decisions. Sometimes I made personnel decisions he disagreed with in his advice. And sometimes I made publishing decisions that were different than he would have done, as he said, if he were in my job, but he wasn't. He left it completely up to me, except for the Unabomber demand. The Unabomber demanded in his manifesto that the New York Times and the Washington Post publish its long manifesto, or else he would keep killing people. And if we published it, he would stop killing people. And this was after years of killing people with his cleverly made bombs. And so that was not a decision I could make by myself, because it was a different kind of publishing decision. It wasn't about a news story. We did publish lots of news stories about the manifesto and about the decision that he had insisted we make. And as we were coming up towards the deadline, we had meetings in the Justice Department with the leadership of the New York Times. And Don came up with the clever idea that we published the manifesto as an insert into the newspaper, like an advertising insert with different typefaces. We didn't look like any part of the newspaper at all. It looked like it was something somebody else had put in the newspaper, as we would do with advertising circulars. And the New York Times decided to pay for half of it, so that they could say that they also were part of the publishing, as the Unabomber demanded. And that's what we did. And it was interesting because journalism professors, which you and I now are, but I was not back then, thought we did a terrible thing. Because they thought we gave in to a terrorist. But what happened as a result was, in fact, that the younger brother of the Unabomber, eventually he and his wife eventually saw the manifesto and compared it to letters that the Unabomber had sent to them, the brother had sent to him, and realized it probably was him, and turned him in, which was a great difficult thing for them to do, to turn in his brother. But as a result of our publishing it, the Unabomber was caught, and the bombing stopped. And the other thing that journalism professors said that they worried about was that other terrorists would insist that we publish their things, or they would blow people up or whatever, and that never came to pass. Now I'm a journalism professor.
Other decisions that were particularly difficult for you, or that kept you up at night?
Nothing ever kept me up at night. I guess that's another peculiar trait of mine. I will think about things very carefully and eventually make decisions. And usually they aren't 90-10 decisions or 80-20. They're more like 60-40. But probably the most important one I made in terms of the country and in terms of journalism was the decision to, after 9/11, President George W. Bush, among other things, secretly authorized the CIA to carry out a covert war against terrorism pretty much in any way that they wanted to. And one of the things they did was set up CIA secret prisons, secret ones in several Eastern European countries, where they captured terrorists were taken and were interrogated, and we now know were tortured in some cases. Dana Priest, who I already mentioned in connection with the Walter Reed story, one of the great reporters at the Washington Post, was covering intelligence. I assigned her to cover intelligence after 9/11, and she made many, many good sources in the intelligence community, and nobody gave her this story. There's no whistleblower. Instead, by interviewing people for other stories about having to do with the covert war against terrorism, she began to figure out that her sources were very worried about something the CIA was doing and what impact it could have on the CIA and whether or not it was morally wrong. And that was the CIA secret prison. She pieced together the story very carefully. And as normal practice, then she would go to the CIA in order to see if her facts were right and to listen to whether or not they had any concerns about whether publishing the stories would damage national security or harm human life. Eventually, We made some decisions on our own that we were not going to report on some other things she discovered about counterterrorism work that these countries were doing with the United States, because they did not involve the legal and moral questions of these secret prisons. And so eventually the CIA had us over there. The director of national intelligence and the director of the CIA talked to us about it and made their case about why they thought we should not publish the story. And most of it didn't move me. They were concerned about whether or not foreign countries would no longer think that they could keep their secrets. I figured that was their problem. The director of the CIA was afraid of losing face within his own agency if we published the story. I didn't think that was our problem. The only thing I paid attention to closely was that they said they probably would have to shut these secret prisons down and bring the prisoners back to the United States if we published the story. And I did not feel that would damage national security at all. And in fact, obviously would then bring these prisoners within the American legal system as they are today. And then the President of the United States called Don Graham, the publisher, and said he would want to talk to him about trying to talk us out of publishing the story. And Don said, it's not his decision, it's mine. So Don and I and the publisher of the paper at the time, Bo Jones, went to the White House for an 8:30 meeting one morning. The president made his case, and the director of national intelligence was there also, and the vice president was hostile to the whole idea, sitting right across from me with his mean face on. And I asked the same questions I always asked about exactly what harm this would do, and heard essentially the same things. And then on the way out of the Oval Office, the director of national intelligence, who I had known some from his previous work as an ambassador in Latin America, literally put his arm around my shoulder and said, "You're not going to name those countries, are you?" And that to me felt that was the bottom line, that any real harm would be from naming the countries because they were engaged in other quite legal, quite moral counterterrorism work with the United States. And naming them at that time would probably blow the whole thing up. The governments could fall. They were democratic countries, and this was all a secret in their country, et cetera. So after thinking about it some more, I decided to publish the story, but to leave the names of the countries out. We did say they were in Eastern Europe, and indeed they were. The sites were shut down, and the prisoners were brought back to the United States. And over 2 years, the Senate Intelligence Committee studied all this, investigated all this, and in the end came out with a report that not only corroborated our stories, but also concluded for the first time that these sites were used for torture.
What's interesting about your description of sort of what your thought process was in that, in making that decision, you mentioned that you were seasoned previously by giving too much faith in what the government or a president might have asked you to do. And you name that as sort of one of the mistakes that you made early on, in that I can't remember specifically what it is they had asked you to do.
It was the Ivy Bells. That was when Ben was still executive editor. I was managing editor, and a young man named Ron Pelton, who was a very junior person at the National Security Agency, for some reason was in possession of one of the biggest secrets the NSA had, which was a really stupid thing on the NSA part, which was that the United States was literally tapping the underground cables, the Russians' underground cables, through which they communicated with their submarines. And when Pelton was arrested and charged with spying, they did not reveal what it was that he did, what he sold to the Russians. And Bob Woodward and another reporter named Pat Tyler found out what it was. And we went through many months of listening to various administration officials make various arguments about why we should not publish the story. It just went on for a long time. We didn't put that much faith in what they were telling us, but they kept raising issues that made us wonder whether or not we might be harming national security. Although we finally came to the conclusion that the Russians, in fact, we were told by a former director of the CIA whom we consulted on this, and of course the Russians already knew the secret. We wouldn't be revealing it. They already got it from Ron Pelton. But still, we dithered for too long. And so finally, NBC broke the story right at the eve of the trial with only a small part of the story, but they were able to name Ivy Bells as the thing. And so we were then published our much fuller story and other stories after that. But I made that decision, as I said in the book, that next time I would not dither. I would, one way or the other, make the decision a lot sooner and try to figure out no matter what the government told us. Because really, I concluded that what the NSA was trying to cover up was their own negligence. Ron Pelton should not have had that information to sell. And it wasn't really about national security at all. So over the years, there are a number of other decisions to be made. Usually it was the director of the CIA or somebody like that who was trying to get us to withhold the story. I never did not publish a story because of national security reasons, although some of the stories that we published, we would leave out information that was not that important to readers, like the name of a covert operation or people involved in it, that sort of thing, that could create harm, but still were able to give our readers the story that they should have about what their government was doing in their name.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat that go back to Bob Woodward. And for the students that are not in my class, let me give you a little bit of background. There was an Ask Me Anything session at Investigative Reporters and Editors, of which Len Downie Jr. is a founding member. And that went back and forth about Bob Woodward's new book, Rage, and what he knew and when he knew it, about his interviews with Trump and what Trump knew early on in COVID, and whether or not Woodward should have been more transparent in what he knew about what Trump told him. Woodward's argument is, I couldn't believe anything Trump said immediately. I had to check it. By the time I was clear, everybody else knew. Other people have pushed back and said Woodward had an obligation to give this information to the American public. And then there was a big dust up with the way he handled a reporter who pushed him pretty hard on it. You have some background on this because you managed Bob Woodward's reporting that appeared in the newspaper, as well as the very successful books that he was writing. And you also had a no surprises rule that at least once he seemed to have violated. How does, first of all, tell us a little bit about how you read that situation, but also what is a journalist's obligation in weighing these two things? Their obligation to get information to the public as soon as possible, with perhaps holding it, investigating it a little more, putting it into a bigger context of a book.
Right. When all the time I was executive editor, Bob and I had a relationship in which he kept me informed, not always sooner, sometimes later, about what he was working on. And two things about that. One was he did come to me sometimes with information he had in his reporting for a book that he thought it should be in the Post right away. And I would agree. And that meant that he would have to go back to his source or sources with whom he had the agreement that he always had for his books, which is, I'm interviewing you only for this book and not for the newspaper right now. And he'd have to go back and get them to agree to a change in the ground rules for a particular story. And we did that. We published some stories that came from that. Secondly, he would help whenever he could with tips for other reporters to follow up on things that he discovered in his reporting that were not central to the book he was working on, but he thought ought to be in the newspaper and somebody else could check it out. Thirdly, whenever needed, he would come in and work for the Washington Post. After 9/11, he was there right that morning and working for us for quite a while on investigative reporting about what went wrong with 9/11, including naming Osama bin Laden as being behind 9/11 in the very next day's Washington Post on the front page, which nobody else had. So he was always, I never felt that he kept anything away from the newspaper that we needed. And fourthly, whenever, just before each book was published, we would excerpt all the things in the book that I thought were important for our readers. And what I or another editor of the Post would go through the book and pick out what we wanted, and a series of articles would run. It gave our readers the first crack at the information that was going to be in that book. And so I never felt that he let us down or let our readers down at any time during all that work, even though there were times, as I say in the book, when it took me a while to figure out exactly what he was working on and what we wanted to do with it. I don't know what a relationship he has with the Post, if at all now. He still is listed as associate editor, I think, and gets paid a token amount of money. And so I don't know whether or not there were any conversations between him and the newspaper about what the president was telling him at that time. And not being involved in that, I can't say what I would have thought to do if I was the editor and he had been telling me what the president was saying in those early hours. I understand. Obviously, if he had published something in March, for example, then a whole lot of conversations with the president that are now in the book would not have taken place. And so that would have been a loss for the public in one way. I don't know if he had published something or went on television and said something about what the president was telling him in March, how much difference that would have made to what the president was doing about COVID or the public's understanding of it, as we kind of go back to that period and try to figure it out. So I don't know what I would have done if I were involved.
I'm going to ask a question from Isabel that relates to this. And is it harmful for journalists to put people like Woodward, who these days he's basically a celebrity journalist and very well known? Is it harmful to put them on a pedestal?
I don't put him on a pedestal.
Well, not necessarily you, I think, but young journalists.
You probably shouldn't either. I mean, I like two different things to think about that question. One was no journalist should be put on a pedestal, and then not even Bob Woodward with all that he's accomplished, not even Dana Priest, who I think is his equal as a reporter and his double Pulitzer Prize winner. They're just ordinary people, and they should be judged on their work all the time, and not be thought of as celebrities, even though it's inevitable in our society that they become celebrities. The second part of that is the celebrity part, and that's the part that I do worry about. I worry about fact-finding journalists being on television in these panel discussions in ways in which they are giving their opinions about things. Bob and Carl have clearly crossed that bridge, and they both do freely give their opinions now on television, but they're no longer working for the Washington Post. They're no longer publishing things in the Washington Post, at least. And so that's probably not a problem. But there are other reporters who are working all the time, who are covering the White House, covering politics and so on, who are on these shows. And most of the time they're not expressing opinions, but they're on a panel with other people who are expressing opinions and trying to get them to express opinions. And I think that's a problem. I think that at this time, when the credibility of fact-finding journalism is being attacked, I think it's a problem for reporters to be seen as being opinion people, as opposed to just fact-finding reporters.
And would you extend that to social media as well?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, social media is useful for, getting the word out right away. I just found out X and we're going to write a story about it, or promoting your story. But I think expressing opinions on the internet is compromising.
So let me sort of flip to the future a little bit on a couple of last questions. What gives you the most hope about the future of journalism? We've talked about some of the dire parts. We've certainly had a lot of loss in terms of local journalism. Every newsroom has shrunk pretty much. What do you look forward to, and what gives you hope of what the new era of journalism will look like?
Right. The first thing that gives me hope are our students, your students and mine and the other students. The best students are motivated. They're very smart. They have the right reasons for the mission of journalism, and they are learning things that you and I didn't learn when we were younger, and that I still haven't learned in my case, which is all these digital skills, and they're becoming multimedia journalists who can use all the digital tools in their reporting, and they can use all the digital tools in their presentation of their work. And that's a big advantage. That's not true for still a relatively large number of existing journalists and news organizations who don't have that, didn't have that training. And so they give me great hope. I teach master's students in investigative reporting for the Cronkite School's Howard Center Investigative Reporting, and my students are amazing and are way ahead
Yeah,
of
mine too.
yeah, they're way ahead of where I was at their age. So that gives me hope. The second thing that gives me hope, in fact, is going to be my next project, and that is the future of local news. A lot of, as you point out, a lot of bad things have happened to local news. Many newsrooms have been cut down to almost nothing, and yet two things about them are about those newsrooms are still encouraging to me. One is they somehow devote a disproportionate amount of their much reduced resources to investigative reporting. You look at the Pulitzer Prizes and the other prizes and you see amazing investigative reporting from newsrooms that we know are a shadow of what they used to be, because they're determined to work on that in particular, to give that a high priority. That still is a problem, that they can't cover education and the city council and the state government the way they used to, and that's still a huge problem. But at least they're focused on one kind of journalism that makes a difference. The other thing is that there are a lot of changes that are just beginning to happen. A lot of work that's being done to try to revive local news. Some of it is some things like Report in America that are sending reporters to these newsrooms. Others are ways of trying to help these newsrooms change their economics, maybe change their ownership in the case of those that have bad chain ownership. And also the rise of internet-only websites, which went much lower overhead, some of which are for-profit and many of which are nonprofit. And again, there are new organizations cropping up to raise money for them, help them figure out how they do their work and so on. So there's a movement going on out there. It's still nascent, but there's a movement going on that I'm going to spend the next year or so researching and writing about.
Oh, good. Glad to hear it. So let's leave on the last question with a little bit of advice for all of these young muckrakers here. Is there any specific advice that you would give to young journalists who are interested in pursuing investigative reporting? And part of that question is, how do you know when that story is worth going after?
Oh my God, I'm afraid my answer to that is you never know right away. You can do some. I mean, Maud Beelman, who is the executive editor of the Howard Center for Investigative Reporting, actually has a terrific handout about this, where she has the criteria for how do you decide to pursue something as an investigative story. Do you think that does it appear that something's going wrong? Do you appear that people are being victimized in some way? And that doesn't just mean by fraud. It can be by, living in neighborhoods that have a disproportionate amount of cancer-causing chemicals in the air, for example. Where are the problems that need to be addressed? And that's one way of figuring out what it is you want to pursue. My advice to young and prospective investigative reporters is become a very skilled, multi-skilled journalist. Take whatever job you can find at whatever news organization that you think is reputable. And I do think there's some you probably ought to stay away from. I'll mention one by name, Sinclair, for example. But find reputable news organizations. And if they want you principally to be somebody who's working on their website, to post stories on the website, fine. If they want you to be a videographer first, fine. But then do what Bob Woodward did when he was a night police reporter as a young reporter at the Washington Post. Go out and find other stories. Go out and find investigative stories while you're doing what it is you're supposed to be doing. Don't slack on the job you got to get done right, but then go and find stories on your own. Those people will be noticed. When it comes time to apply to a larger news organization, they will notice that work that you did, the other work that you also did well, the fact that you're a multi-skilled journalist, and the fact that you will go the extra mile to produce good journalism.
And I'll ask one more question from Adriana. And do you have a favorite part of the journalistic process? You're interviewing, the researching, the writing, the editing.
I
or you
have,
just love being in the middle of all of it?
well, I love being in the middle of all of it. I have to say that interviewing for me at first, these students should know this because many students would be like me, that interviewing could be difficult at the beginning if you're not already a gregarious person. And so that was the hard part for me. In fact, it was
For
actually,
introverts, yes.
yeah, right. Or antisocial in my case.
Mhm.
But so you have to work at the things that are hard to do. But otherwise, no, I loved everything. I have to say that, editing was particularly wonderful because I hired, Ben and I hired all these amazing journalists who were so much more talented than we were, and enabling them to do their best work was the most fun. I was a very involved executive editor. I did not sit in my office overseeing the newsroom. I was out in the newsroom all the time, in the midst of stories, deciding every day what went on the front page, and being able to work in that kind of detail with all these very talented journalists was just amazing. And that's what I enjoyed the most.
That's terrific. Well, Len, thank you so much for having a conversation with us. I do look forward to seeing what you come up with on local news, since that is a very big need for young journalists. But thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.